Welcome to the Psyched to Practice podcast. Before we get to today's conversation, we want to highlight something special about this episode. It's part of our continuing education series, which means you have the opportunity to earn CE credits. So here's how it works. After you finish the episode, head over to psychedpractice.com. You'll see the episode listed with a short exam designed to reinforce the material covered. When you purchase and complete that exam, you'll have access to the CE certificate to apply towards your professional continuing education requirements. We know how important continuing education is for mental health professionals. It's not just about maintaining licensure, it's about staying current, sharpening your skills, and bringing fresh insights back to the clients you serve. That's why we've designed this process to be as smooth and flexible as possible. You can listen on your commute, during a break, or whenever fits your schedule, and then take the exam at your convenience. Now, for those of you who want more than just an individual exam, we've created the Brightminds subscription. With Brightminds, you're not limited to just a single episode. You gain access to our entire library of CEU eligible podcast episodes. Plus, gain access to exclusive home study webinars on emerging topics in psychology, and you'll have the chance to register for live events where you can engage with the presenter in real time, ask questions, and connect with other professionals. Think of Brightminds as an all-in-one continuing education hub. Whether you're catching up on demand or joining a live session, you'll find content designed to meet you where you are in your professional journey. It's an efficient way to stay engaged with evidence-based practices, earn CEUs, and be part of a community that's passionate about advancing the field. So you have options. If this episode stands out and you'd like a CE credit for it, you can purchase the exam individually. Or if you're ready to broaden your learning and take advantage of our full range of resources, Brightminds may be the perfect fit. Both are available right now at psychedpractice.com. With that, let's get to today's CEU eligible episode of the Psyched to Practice podcast. Hello and welcome to the Psyched to Practice podcast, your one-stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insights from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Paul Wagner, and it's just me today and doing a bit of a throwback episode where combining a past 3-part episode down into one because it was such a great episode. So the reason we're wanting to do this is as we're focusing on the website after we've launched Psyched to Practice as a CE platform. So it is live. You can go to www.psychedpractice.com. You can purchase individual courses for CE credits, and something really cool that we're doing is we're offering a subscription model. So for $300, you get 1 year's access, and it's kind of an all-you-can-earn buffet of CEs. We have some great presenters on there. We have a lot of past podcast episodes, and it's a wonderful opportunity to earn your continuing education all in one rather than trying to piecemeal it together. And we're going to be constantly updating this so that way you're staying up to date with what's going on in the field of psychology. And currently we're running a promotion where if you are an early subscriber for the first year, you are able to get 50% off. So it drops that price down to $150 for a year of all you can earn CE credits. So head over to www.psychedpractice.com and look for our Brightmind subscription. Now, most of the links right now will automatically apply that discount. However, if for some reason you are at a link that hasn't, if you enter the code ambassador, all uppercase, then it will apply that discount for you and you can take advantage of everything we have to offer. So with that, we hope you enjoy this remixed episode of Beliefs, Blindspots, and Biases.
We're here again for another duo episode, and this actually is kind of an interesting topic for me. So, we're going to really kind of focus on this idea of beliefs, blind spots, and biases. And I think that with everything that goes on in the world today, we see biases all the time. Interesting to have an episode.
Definitely a topical conversation, that's for sure. And with that, we're thinking of having a specific format for today that we're going to be explaining each specific bias that we're covering. And then really kind of hearing one another's thoughts about the process, whether that's professional, personal, or somewhere in between.
Sounds fun.
Well, and I guess to start, wondering, we've been on this topic and we've been trying to do some preparation here. Ray, for you, what got you interested in talking about biases, and why are we talking about it today for you?
Yeah, so I think this topic's come up for a lot of reasons. Again, just things that we see in the world every day. But for me, I think it's interesting. I've known about biases probably longer than I knew I wanted to be a psychologist. So I actually kind of got into biases as part of a philosophy class when I was in undergrad, and was doing some research, and it actually wasn't even on biases. It was about being a skeptic. And I came across this article that's still, I think, pretty relevant today. And it's by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. People may know Daniel Kahneman because he's done, I think, a bunch of TED Talks at this point. So he's out there. But they wrote this article back in like 1974 called Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases. It was the first time I actually heard the word cognitive biases. And so reading it, it was interesting because it made me, I think, look at myself and go, a second, like, am I biased in how I think about things and how I'm processing information? And so I got really interested in it. And I think, as we develop as critical thinkers, right, we more and more, I think, have to pay attention to those things. It started for me like way back, and I think about them all the time. How about for you?
I mean, bias it's such a common word, I think, to get thrown around. And for the longest time, I really thought of myself as like, I'm not biased. I'm self-aware.
Sure.
And then I think really for me, that change came in my graduate program in a diversity class, and talking about just the idea of privilege and the role that it plays, and how, when we have privilege and we're not aware of that privilege, then we have biases, and then we judge others based off different criteria. And like that really took me aback. And, I am a young, white, cisgendered, heterosexual male. And so I have all the privilege. And, thinking of it in those terms, it really tried to pull me out of my perspective and just trying to have a larger worldview approach, rather than just kind of that first person perspective that I was really approaching things. And so for me at that point, it really brought this idea of biases to life, and have been trying to be aware of it, certainly stumbling my way at times, but trying to be aware of it as we go on, and trying to use that information to make better informed decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. We're going to have kind of focusing today on this idea of cognitive bias, kind of your exposure coming from this idea of a social perspective, and how these cognitive biases, I think, influence us, and you're right. I think this is a word people say all the time, and I'm not sure all the time they know what they're kind of referring to, So when you're saying cognitive bias, like how do you define it? What is that for you?
I would say like the concept that I hold for it is really just shortcuts. It's the idea that I try to make shortcuts, whether that's in the way that I process information and in the judgments that I make, or in the decision-making process. And so being able to kind of rely on those without really questioning ends up being a concern. I think certainly we see that take place when we're in performance art, where, individuals with sleight of hand or optical illusions,
Sure.
We have a perception that isn't being seen as reality. And we can, we're left mystified, but really, we have these biases of how things should go. And when they don't, we're then left being thrown off. And so being able to grow and expand our awareness of that, I think it ends up having us be better informed thinkers. But, that's, I think at the core of it is it just becomes a shortcut, and in some ways maybe offers us a security.
So I like kind of how you refer to it as shortcuts. I kind of see it the same way. And I think your reference to illusion is really important because, I think in those situations, at some point we know it's not real, and we can kind of look at that differently. I think sometimes we don't do that with our own thoughts, though. So from the outside, we can look and go, okay, yeah, we know the guy is not floating someone over a table, but we don't necessarily, I think, when we're thinking about our own thoughts, do that well. And so for me, maybe my kind of definition is maybe a little bit more formal, but, I kind of start with the idea. I think it's something that we're often unaware of. I don't always think biases are purposeful. I think sometimes we're not even paying attention to them. But then beyond that, I think it's, our thoughts. There are buried beliefs that we don't want to acknowledge sometimes. There are prejudices, all of those things. So basically, any of these things we're unaware of that influence our decisions. I think that's kind of a simple definition for me. And I think we're better thinkers when we are aware of them. I know I catch myself all the time, whether it's professional or personal, it's easy to slip into those shortcuts in thinking. And, so I think awareness is maybe number one in how we deal with them.
With that, why don't we get into talking about some of the specific biases that we fall prey to? And the first one here is going to be the confirmation bias. And I think of all of them, like that's probably the one that, if I'm thinking about a bias, that's one of the first ones that comes to mind. But, for the sake of a shared understanding, when we're talking about the confirmation bias here, we're talking about something that involves having favored thoughts or focusing on information that confirms our existing beliefs or preconceptions. We're predisposed to discount information that doesn't really confirm our belief system. And so when we're talking about this idea, Ray, for you, if you can think what professionally, personally, how's the confirmation bias impacted you?
Yeah, I think we see this everywhere. I mean, it's, for me, as you were reading it, I think, probably where I'm seeing maybe the impact the most now is just how pervasive it is on the internet and social media, where we may have a thought and whatever algorithms they use, it seems like they're able to find what we believe and to just keep reinforcing it with maybe articles we want to read on similar topics or whatever it is. And then I think we end up not then looking at other information. So, I mean, I think I'm seeing that more and more. I mean, and I think we've had this we've talked about this in other episodes, but I'm even seeing it with patients where they'll, see something with maybe a symptom or set of symptoms, and then they find everything they can in their life that confirms that they may have a certain diagnosis. And a lot of that's, again, it's kind of social media driven. So I think I'm seeing it there more heavily, but I think it's all over. How about for you?
Well, and the way you're putting that, like the term manufactured confirmation bias, and that's really what these algorithms are,
right?
Or these targeted ads, and it's trying to, it becomes this echo chamber back where we're hearing our own belief systems, or we're getting the validation without really recognizing that it's only a very narrow view based off what's being given to us. So that's an interesting thought.
Coin that term, manufactured confirmation bias. No, but I do think that that's happening now. I mean, I think it's, we know that exists. I mean, we know that, our what we like and what we believe, social media algorithms know how to reinforce that. I mean, not even social media, even just my news feed. If I read a few food articles, I'm going to get 10 other food articles, right? It continually goes with my interests. So maybe this confirmation bias is even more concerning when it's not even just our own seeking of information, but we have media that also confirms our biases.
And I think this ends up being so divisive, especially with certain topics. So, politics is one of the bigger ones that come to mind. And, when we are thinking of whether it's elections or those uncomfortable conversations that happen typically at every family holiday, at least personally, I know that happens. And this idea of opposing belief systems, how can you even think about that? Or, what are you thinking? And how can you not see it in my way? And then when someone does agree, it's like, oh, this person is finally talking some sense without really ever hearing truly the other side in that unbiased way. And so, I think and kind of looking at that definition again, discounting information, and certainly with those areas that we can really attach ourselves in terms of identity or the roles that we play. I think that trying to then discount information that goes against that, because if we don't do that, then we might start to break down this idea of like, oh, I view myself as a Democrat, or I view myself as a Republican. How much of that is just because I'm not actually listening to what the other side has to say?
Well, I mean, I think that's probably the key, right? Is that we avoid, or we kind of discount the fact that there's other opinions. And Yeah, I think back to being kind of an early grad student, and I don't remember kind of when in my education it happened, but one of the I think probably best conferences I ever went to was an APA conference, and happened to go to this panel discussion that was about psychotherapy. And they had, and I don't remember who all the panelists were, but essentially there was a cognitive behavior therapist, there was a short-term dynamic therapist, there was a Gestalt therapist, probably 6 or 7 people. And they all had differing and incredibly strong opinions, but that wasn't what I remembered. What I remembered was the fact that they all heard each other, and at the end started talking about their similarities more than their differences. And for me, it was pretty eye-opening, because I was like, wow, this is what real debate looks like. We have opinions, we argue our opinions, we put forth everything that we want to share, but the other part was listening and letting our own knowledge expand because of somebody else's knowledge. And I think that's where confirmation bias gets in the way. And you mentioned politics, and I check myself all the time. Like I always kind of go, man, if I'm getting emotional about something, I'm probably not listening to the other piece of it. There's an echo chamber of thoughts that are going on in my head that's just polarizing my view. And so it's a check for me where I go, all right, I'm going to read the counter argument to this. And I always find it really balances for me. Like at the end, I'll read it. Even if I don't agree with the counter argument, I go, all right, there's another side to the story. So I think that keeps me, it doesn't necessarily always change my thought completely, but it gives me a better balance in my view, I guess.
And so maybe an idea of, how do we become aware of and even try to challenge the confirmation bias is like, do we understand the opposition and understanding it in some ways without judgment, and then letting that judgment come secondary to a fuller understanding of what the topic is that we're talking about, rather than those pre-existing or preconceived ones that we're trying to really kind of reinforce or allow our side of it to be right rather than just different.
Yeah. And I don't even know if, and maybe this is really spreading things too thin, I'm not even sure we have to fully understand the other argument. I think we have to hear it. And I mean, there's arguments that I hear that I'll respect, but I don't necessarily always understand them completely. But it allows me to at least respect that there is another opinion, and to hear that opinion. And even that little bit of just listening, I think, takes us from these far extremes in our thoughts. I think it brings us at least a little bit closer to the middle sometimes. So yeah, I mean, I do think we just have to listen sometimes to other information.
And it reminds me of just so many different times in the therapy setting when someone's coming in and someone's sharing their story, and so often my listening, that's my first role. So, so I'm just wanting to be a listener and hearing their experience, whatever that may be. And certainly if the confirmation bias is there and, oh, I know what this is, or, I already know where this is going, it takes away from that respect piece and being able to hear it in its entirety. And then us coming to that joint decision rather than, me 10 words in deciding this is where we're going with this conversation.
Right.
Yeah, and it ends up, I think, especially as clinicians, if we can recognize how we're taking that confirmation bias into the session and we can work to challenge it and focus in on that listening piece, it makes us better clinicians.
Yeah. And I think it's something important also to teach people we work with. Many times I'll have a conversation with someone where they're on that kind of strong path. I just had a recent one with an adolescent who's having conflict with a teacher at school. And the teacher in this individual's eyes is the worst teacher in the world. And I made the comment, I said, wouldn't it be interesting to find times when she's not the worst teacher in the world? Like, have you heard any, can we find some information or heard any information about, people that like this individual, that think she's a good teacher? And it was, the student quickly was like, oh, it's just the smart kids like her. I'm like, but then she's not the worst teacher in the world if some people like her, let's just break that kind of thought. But it was interesting because we were talking about, I said, I said, you tend to find and want to talk to the teacher about everybody who agrees with you. And, and we even, I think I even called out the fact that like you find ways to confirm the fact that she's a terrible teacher. Let's look on the other end of that. Like, can we expand our thinking? And it was an interesting conversation. I'm not sure. We'll have to see how far this goes and if it's therapeutically valuable, but it at least put a question mark that, there's more to the story than it's just this person's a bad teacher. So I think we can use it with clients all the time.
I think just expanding awareness and developing that, hey, let's not make these absolute judgments of the worst teacher in the world, but rather maybe this is the worst teacher for me. And how different is that? When we're making judgments and, individual experience might not be that different, but it can also then say, what's my role versus what's the teacher role? Because if they're the worst teacher in the world, nothing you can do about that. But if they're the worst teacher for me, well, then what is it about me that I'm bringing into this that's making it, this conflict? So certainly, just that small challenging there can offers a lot more flexibility than the all or nothing of, no, you're right. She's the terrible.
And but I think this is where these biases, all of them that we're going to talk about, kind of come in. Like we see them in the therapy room all the time. It's and I think confirmation bias is probably the most prominent and probably what most people will kind of go, oh yeah, I'm familiar with that.
And with that, maybe let's talk about some of the other ones that maybe people are a bit less familiar with. And the next one that we're really wanting to jump into is this idea of the anchoring bias.
Okay.
And so when we're talking about that, anchoring bias is the tendency to heavily rely on or anchor on the first piece of information that you learn or on one specific trait. So in other words, it's the first piece of information that has this substantial impact on our judgment. And then any information that comes later on, especially that has a challenging or differing view of that, we tend to offer less value to or give less significance. And again, I think it's certainly prominent in so many areas. And I think this is also the bias that I've heard referred to as the first impression bias as well. And so, that what a common phrase, you want to leave a good first impression, and there's a bias because of it. And so, Ray, what's your experience with the anchoring bias, and how have you seen it in your life?
I think that this can, again, it's one of these ones I think we see across areas. I mean, I think if we think just kind of maybe in everyday life, I think we see it a lot in marketing and in sales and, where you'll see somebody price something really high, and then anything that is priced at a lower rate, people think have lesser value. I mean, I think there are clothing brands that are brilliant with this. I'm not sure they're better clothes, but their name is associated with high prices. That becomes the anchor. So if you see another shirt that could be better quality, but is instead of $50, it's $25, you somehow believe that that's a lesser quality shirt when in fact they both probably cost the same to make. But it's just a marketing tool. So I mean, I think we see it in that. I think we see it a lot even clinically. I think it's one that I'm very aware of when we do diagnosis and we're doing evaluations, just mainly because I think it's easy to focus on the initial symptoms that somebody presents. So they come in and our first question is, why are you here to see us? What brought you into for this appointment? So they're going to list the most prominent symptoms first, and we kind of anchor there. And I think sometimes that results in us maybe discounting other evidence that might lead to a more accurate diagnosis. I've thought about this with ADHD a lot because I think, that's what people come in and they, I can't focus, I'm distracted, I'm restless, and all of those symptoms that we all associate with ADHD. But if we kind of anchor there, I think sometimes we miss the fact that depression and anxiety and just life can sometimes make us have all of those symptoms. And then we see a misdiagnosis in the end. So I think we could see it in different areas. I mean, those are kind of two I can think of.
Well, and I think not only in diagnostics, but in treatment as well. Mm. And, if if I only focused in on that initial concern that someone had when they walked in, then that is going to be a very skewed perception because oftentimes in the intake process, it becomes this like semi-formal and like exchange of information, which I don't think always offers an opportunity for there to be a full understanding of the person and the kind of the scope of things that we're operating with. And so even that, I think, if we're anchoring to that initial, this is the concern, then the next time someone comes walking in, I'm like, all right, let's hit this heavy. And if they're feeling disconnected from that initial session, then we might not be working, I might not have the full picture and I might not be able to work and attend to all the different complex areas and kind of seeing how it all interconnects and relates. So I am thinking of an individual whom came in for, she was really struggling with just a lot of relational anxiety. And, as we're talking about it, then in comes trauma, then in comes, making decisions passed in her life for everyone else but herself. And so, in relationships, feeling very insecure, but very much impacted by those formative experiences in her, in her development that there was trauma with, and that there's a strong trauma association with, and as well as, these pressured decisions that she's made later on in her life and leaving her feeling like she doesn't have much of a voice. And so to kind of only focus in on the relationships would be doing her a disservice. And if we're able to kind of step back away from that, or maybe kind of pull the anchor up a little bit, if I'm running with the metaphor, we're able to cover a lot more ground. We're able to really kind of go into more in depth on the areas that feel significant in those moments, but also then being able to be mindful of all the waters that we've traveled.
Yeah, that's a great kind of example. I'm kind of, as you were talking, it had me thinking about a whole bunch of other things here. Are there ways that these biases are used in a positive way in therapy? It's interesting. I was, for some reason, as you were kind of talking, I was thinking, like, is there a value sometimes when we maybe present higher level of what someone needs to do to solve a problem, and then present one that is maybe a little less difficult as a way for them to at least start the treatment process? Like, is that a way that we're using a cognitive bias in a positive way? Like, it sounds a little manipulative to me, but it also is sometimes, I think that, is that what when we're providing those options and saying, well, here's one option, or here's another option. It makes me think of an infomercial. This is $100, but today it's $89.99 or whatever it is. I guess we're talking about these as problematic, but are there ways therapeutically that we can use them to maybe help motivate people? Or do you think I'm harmful on that?
Because I think, and if I'm thinking about my concept of these cognitive biases, innately, there's not a negative intention behind them. It's, it's the simplification, or it's this, we're trying to, we are such complex beings, and we're I think we only kind of ever present a fraction of that at a given time. And so it's a way that all of that past experience, present, sensory inputs, the cognitive process, all of that can kind of be distilled down and make sense of it through these biases. And so being able to not look at it as, biases are always negative, but rather biases are something that is present. And if we can be aware of it, we get to then determine the impact that they have. And so I didn't really think of it in those terms the way you were talking about it. But when I'm talking with individuals and we're trying to kind of talk about generating change, the first thing that I will always go to is actually, so we can continue to do what you're doing now, but that's not really working, is it? And it just kind of anchors in on this, like, this idea of where it's at. This isn't working. And I think I really try to, because that's how we're talking about it. It's because you don't like, so what are the other options? And it, like, if we can pull up that anchor from that one, it gives that freedom of mobility. But I think exactly what you're saying, we have to kind of first lock ourselves in one area first to be able to make it effective. And kind of, we have to use the anchoring bias to then challenge the anchoring bias rather than not let it be there at all.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's, again, I kind of came out of my thoughts here was just, I never present interventions to people from the easiest to hardest. I always give them what the hardest is first, right? Like, so it's not like, oh, you could do relaxation on your own every day for the next few weeks, or you can do this and it's, maybe it's a higher level situation. I kind of always start and go, all right, here's one option, but you also have these other options, and they tend to be some that are maybe more manageable. And as I do it, I think I do it purposefully as a motivation. And sometimes people go, no, let's go all in. I'm going for the hardest first. And some say, no, it'll be easier if I try maybe this one thing first. But then it lets us build momentum. So, I do think keeping in mind that these can be used therapeutically in a positive way, I think is important.
And makes me think in terms of going back to the confirmation bias.
Right.
What are some of the positive uses of that therapeutically, if there's any? And there are not any that jump to mind initially, but kind of go back into that headspace and thinking about, our belief systems, because if we're thinking more beliefs rather than decision making, it can be valuable to, if I have a belief system that I am thinking about values and morals, like, if I'm a hard worker, or if I'm this, then that could be motivation. And, if we can kind of pull on those pieces, if it doesn't really hurt anything to say, let's think about all the times you haven't been a hard worker. Let's think of all the times you haven't been, this person. But if that's not really the area that we're looking to change, we can kind of use that to fuel the fire of motivation.
Yeah. I think that's possible. I think the confirmation bias is probably a little harder sometimes, but I do think in that way, we do see people that, let's just use for depression as an example. Somewhere at some point, I had somebody tell me, depression is like wearing blue sunglasses. Everything starts looking blue and you start finding everything that kind of confirms it. So I do think we can kind of work with that when we're trying to get people to find these other good events in their life. Like it does go in reverse direction, I think, therapeutically.
And, I don't know that the same will be true for all of the biases that we're talking about. It'd be an interesting thought to keep in mind to say, like, again, can we look at this from a non-bias? Can we be non-biased against biases and, try to look at the positives as well as some of the negative impacts they have?
I think the marketing world does that well. I remember from, kind of just a social psychology class and biases being talked about. And, in some way we see plays on that in the marketing world to try to get us to, believe that their product's a great product. Is that always great? And can it go too far? Absolutely. But on a certain level, they sometimes, like I said, I guess I keep going back to motivation. I think sometimes we can use them as motivators and they're not always necessarily harmful. Awareness of them is important. I think that maybe that goes back to the key, because if we're not aware that they happen, that's when it becomes.
I think awareness ends up being a really important theme here. And I'm expecting that we're probably going to see it playing a role, throughout all of these biases. And, as we've kind of called out at the very beginning, we're looking to have this be a multi-part episode. And Ray, I think here's a good point to start pulling back and wrapping things up for this episode. And we're going to look to continue the conversation, continuing to talk about, more different types of biases that are out there, and not only focusing in on the cognitive biases, but I think we're wanting to jump in on some social biases as well. So we hope you enjoyed this episode, and certainly we'll be back next week. Be well and stay psyched.
So, Paul, we're back with the second installment of our episodes regarding beliefs, blind spots, and biases.
Yeah. And, the first one ended up being, we didn't get through nearly as many as we initially thought in that time frame. But I think it just goes to share, like, hey, these can be in-depth concepts. And so wanting to flush them out. And I love kind of where we left off with, biases don't inherently need to have a specific value to them, but that they can be, that they are just something that exists. And it's that awareness piece, I think, was kind of the thing that stood out for me of how important that is.
I agree. Same concept kind of came to mind for me is, I think, one, I was surprised how much we had to say in only covering 2 biases the last time. But the other part is, paying attention to the idea that we don't have to make them good or bad, that they're just something we have to be aware of, and kind of paying attention to how we respond when they happen in our life.
Yeah. Well, and if we're diving back in, I think the next one that we had up on our list was the attribution error. And so in this one, oftentimes it relates to how we perceive our own actions compared to the actions of others. So this in particular relates to this perceived idea of success and failure. Our accomplishments can be the result of a skill or internal traits, whereas failure is a result of these external forces. And I think oftentimes people are more likely to really undervalue the accomplishments or overvalue the mistakes of others. And so, Ray, in terms of the attribution error, what has your experience been with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all have this occur at times, so we're looking at other people and, I was driving yesterday from a conference and I was stuck in traffic and, everyone behaves badly when traffic's bad, and somebody just happens to try to cut me off. My first thought was, man, that guy's a terrible driver. That could be true. I mean, it's absolutely possible. But I think quickly, knowing that we were going to kind of record this episode today, I kind of laughed at myself and went like, okay, there's a million reasons why he could have cut me off. He could have maybe not seen me. He maybe, was just in a hurry. But I wanted to put it on his character. It wasn't a situation of, listen, it was, cars everywhere. People were trying to get to exits, all those things that just naturally happen. My assumption went to, he was a bad driver. It was a character flaw on his part. I think we all do that. So I think on a simple basis, we see that happen frequently.
And I think it can also be something that I'm thinking about it. I mean, other than myself, because I am a phenomenal driver, but, everyone else out there, I try to give them, a fair, internal and external judgments, but thinking about it in terms of like the therapy room and how, whether it's myself as the clinician in the therapy room, or even if it's just kind of in terms of what I'm hearing when I'm working with a client, thinking about how we perceive our own actions. And if we are really only ever focusing on our success is because of this, all of this hard work. When the failures occur, it's the external's fault. So the external needs to change for me to be successful, because clearly I, as a hardworking, accomplished individual, wouldn't be experiencing this if it wasn't for X, Y, Z. And to, again, awareness, if we can pull back and say, okay, is it only this? Or what are the reactions? What are the responses to these stimulus? And how can we not work to, utilize the attribution error and put too much value or weight on these external factors, and being able to say, okay, what's on me, in terms of this failure, what falls onto me? Because if we can focus on that, that's where we can generate change. If it happens externally, then we're helpless. Can't do a thing about it. But if we can focus on, well, how do I react and respond to it? And I think, I want to say it was even Karen when we were talking back in terms of mindfulness, her quote from Viktor Frankl surrounding, the one thing that we can always, or the one thing we always have control over is how we react or respond in various situations. And, I hear that as the awareness, especially of the attribution error of, I don't have to give my power away to the external. I can focus on my reactions to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and I think with attribution error, I think the other piece clinically is that we always have to be aware when people are coming in and we're trying to figure out, maybe why they're having the difficulties they are. It's easy for us to think of that as a character flaw. And I see that with what I think is a misdiagnosis a lot of times of personality disorders, where it's, people are over kind of putting it on these personality traits, and not that they don't exist. I do. But I think, it really makes us need to have this need to really investigate situation and environmental factors that people are in. And, although I think, and this is probably maybe not a popular comment, is I think sometimes we see this with trauma-informed care. And I think the unpopular comment is, I think sometimes we look at it too much, and we can put too much into just viewing it from a trauma perspective. But the good part, I think, with that is that it's made us be much more aware of these situational and environmental factors that influence somebody's behavior, and to really look at that from a situational view rather than a character flaw. And I see this, I think, at least with people who I think are more complex patients that I have where, honestly, it can be frustrating sometimes. We're not making the progress that we would like to make. And, sometimes it feels stalled. And it's always important, I think, for me to step away from that. It's, not a character issue with them, that there's many things that get in the way. I had a patient I saw years ago who I definitely, we were in some frustrating kind of sessions. And what was interesting was when I paused and just kind of went, listen, like, I'm frustrated because I feel like you're not doing what you need to do. And I think I even maybe said it just like that. But I know there's probably barriers that are getting in the way. Tell me what's going on, like what's happening. And, and he started telling me all these situations that were going on in his life. He's caring for his mom who was in a nursing home and things that I knew about superficially. But it really kind of let me kind of step back and go, okay, wait, we're stuck because there's a lot going on that's not his fault at the moment. There's just a lot that he's dealing with, and I have to change my approach. So I think we have to be aware of it in that way as well, because I think we can get easily kind of person blame. And while that could be necessary at times, there's a lot of times it's not.
And as you were sharing there, like I'm thinking about some of the other just kind of diagnosis in which I think that this occurs. And I'm wondering if at times, and the thought goes to depression, especially where the attribution error ends up being a bit reversed. And if any of those, not necessarily externally in judgments towards others, but those internal judgments towards ourselves. And, thinking about how when there's success for individuals whom I'm working with that have some of that severe depressive responses, it's, it only happened because of this, or, this person made this happen. But all of the failures, that's just because I'm just a terrible person. And attribution, not necessarily having to denote one way or the other, but just kind of the overemphasis one direction or the other.
Yeah, I think that absolutely. We can easily attribute things to ourselves that have an environmental reason. Depression's probably, as I'm thinking about what you said, I think that depression is probably the easiest one to see that with, because we put a lot on ourselves in those cases.
And I don't know that I've ever had that thought about the attribution error until just this conversation, but it doesn't only have to be positives, and success for ourselves and then the negatives externally, but it's just more so what we're attributing there.
Yeah.
And another bias that I think relates very, very closely to the attribution error is the self-serving bias. And that is the tendency for us to blame outside forces if something bad happens, as well as taking responsibility when the good things happen. And I think its namesake does it well. It's very self-serving. And, I think so many different pieces of the attribution error come into play when we're talking about the self-serving bias. Mm-hmm. But for you, like, what makes that stand out? Or is there any kind of specific moments or experiences that you have? You're like, this is the self-serving bias. Here it is.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think this is just part of the whole attribution error and just termed a little differently. Yeah. It's interesting. I think when we were talking about these, what comes to mind to me most is actually from a business standpoint and interviewing people and talking to applicants. It's interesting to hear people take a lot of responsibility for their success at jobs, that it was absolutely them. And if something doesn't go well on a job, they had a terrible boss. And it was like, it's real simple. And so like, I'll hear people sometimes in interviews talk about their different positions. And, it's interesting that you never have somebody who just goes, all these situations, it was my involvement. This was a really tough position, but I had a really difficult supervisor and blah, blah. And where jobs that they felt successful on, they talk about the other coworkers. Actually, they don't talk about the other coworkers, and they just did everything well. So, yeah, I think we see that a lot, I think, in those situations. I can even see myself doing that sometimes. We all have, I think that the potential to to be like, yeah, like I'm really good at this. And when it didn't go well, that was whatever I was involved in. So how about for you? When
it reminds me of anytime I'm talking about my ability to do home renovations or anything there, if it goes well, it's just because I'm just that good. And if it doesn't, it's the manufacturer or, the builder, who would have put this like this? But when a project turns out really well, I end up taking so much pride in that. And it's like, sure, I did this. And whether it's, support that I had gotten or just the materials that, ended up connecting really well to it's, I could even, well, I did the research there. So that's my accomplishment. But the moment, this doesn't work, this dumb thing, why did they make it like this? And trying to apply that and just kind of, it's similar. I mean, very, very similar to the attribution error, but being able to recognize when we're not judging things fairly, and when we're skewing that to be either self-serving, for to truly be self-serving, or if we're not really taking accountability. And I think that's one of the things that, whether it's an attribution error or self-serving bias, accountability, I think, is such an important piece here, because if we're not able to own the negatives or the failures, then what can we do?
Yeah, and I again, I think this is a good one to mention, maybe the positive pieces of it, because I kind of view this as a really good way to protect our self-esteem to some extent. And you're talking about the home renovations. Been there. I've done the same thing. I've been like, oh, this is a bad can of paint. It really isn't. It's just, I'm a really bad painter. That's the reality of it. But, I think we can use this sometimes because, again, seeing people who maybe have anxiety or, depression, they may fall into this where they really don't see how good of a student they are, or how good of a worker they are. I have a young man I see who has really significant test anxiety, and it's always this situation where it's interesting because it's not even a negative outcome that he looks at, but if he passes a test, he's like, well, it's a really easy test. Now he studied 20 hours for this test and he busted his butt and did well. And when he doesn't do well, it's a whole different kind of situation for him. It's like he goes into a whole different kind of things, boosting him up to say, like, listen, you passed the test because you studied well. You're a good student, and that's okay. And when you fail the test, it's okay sometimes to say, you know what, it was just a hard test. Because sometimes that's a reality. Sometimes it's not a personal characteristic. So I think we can use self-serving bias sometimes to help people just pay attention to themselves and to give themselves credit when they need to for their effort. Not falsely, but when people are putting the time in and helping them recognize that, I think is important.
And when you were talking about that test taking anxiety and him being a good student, it reminds me of like how we can kind of categorize or, put ourselves in these roles. And if I'm only looking at myself as a test taker, then I'm maybe a very poor test taker, but maybe I'm a really great student.
Yeah.
And taking a test is a part of both of those. And so if I can align my views with, I'm a really good student, and that can form the self-serving bias, then it just increases our ability to see the good or see the value in actions rather than just discrediting it at all.
Sometimes it's okay to take personal responsibility for positive outcomes. We have to give ourselves permission to that. And sometimes it's okay to blame the external factors like that. That's all right. We don't want to get into it all the time. I guess that's, when we're using terms like bias, it's when we overuse these things. It's not using them on a situational basis, I guess.
Yeah. As long as they're serving a purpose. Well, and, another one that kind of touches base with that attribution error is the actor-observer bias. Personally, this is probably the bias that I can remember, back in my social psych class, one of the ones that stood out. I probably wasn't giving it as much value, as I would now sitting in that classroom. But, when we're talking about the actor-observer bias, it's a social cognitive bias. And so it relates to the differences between how we explain our own behavior versus how we explain other people's behavior, where people have a tendency to attribute our own actions to external causes or factors rather than their own personality or actions. And then in contrast, people usually explain the behaviors of others by overemphasizing the influence of their personality or behavior and underemphasizing the situational external factors. And then this definitely occurs when outcomes in situations are negative. And actually, to your point earlier, when you were given the your recent example in traffic, I think that's really when, if I'm remembering correctly, the actor observer bias. I think that was the way it was even explained to me, of being cut off. And I'm a great driver, and everyone else is a terrible driver. And if I'm doing that, because I have a really good reason for it. And so I think a similar concept, but a little bit more specific in terms of when we're an actor, we have full control over, the performance that we're giving, versus if we're just a passive observer, then we're just making judgments in a way. And that's kind of the way that I'm hearing this. But Ray, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. When this kind of came up, one of the things that popped into my mind was just recently I had a individual that I evaluated for bariatric surgery, and it was a woman, and for the evaluation, her husband came to the appointment, and it was interesting. Both were overweight. Wife was at a point where she was looking to definitely make some changes, but the husband was equally overweight. And we were sitting there, and he made this comment about part of this is just that she's lazy. And I kind of call him out and kind of went like, "Tell me why you said that." That's kind of questioning him a bit. And he was like, "Oh, she's overweight because she doesn't eat. She doesn't eat well. She doesn't exercise. She's blah, blah, blah." And he gave me this kind of whole list. And part of me wanted to just maybe question him, but she did it for me. And she's like, "Well, what about you?" She looked at him, and he was like, "It's a medical thing. It's a genetic issue with me. I eat really well." And I was like, wow, like that's such an interesting concept. And we kind of took that conversation, in therapy or in our evaluation a little further, but for interest of time, it was interesting to hear that kind of play out, because, both definitely had some difficulties with weight management, but to hear just in that real time, him kind of go, well, hers was behavioral. It was what she was doing. And mine's just that, I'm genetically predisposed to be overweight. I think I think maybe that happens more in society than we think. I think, and I think with weight and obesity, maybe that's more and more prominent. That we assign it to, some behavioral things. Not to bring pop culture into the mix, but for a while there, I was following kind of the whole Lizzo kind of feeds that were talking about how many people were, criticizing her for her weight and blaming it on all these things. Meanwhile, you watch this lady who's an incredible dancer and does all these other things on stage, but the people's attribute, what they were kind of attributing to her was that it was all because she didn't manage her food. She's not active. She's this and she's that, where, there's really no proof to that. I mean, we don't know what she does, what her eating styles are. She definitely moves better on stage than I could ever do. So, but to kind of just see the public's perception of that it was all due to these personal factors, and they really attacked her, and body shaming and all that stuff that goes into that. So, I think that the actor observer bias, I think we see that a lot with body shaming and those types of issues.
And I think along with that public perception and just the judgments that we can levy at others, I hear it so much as kind of our defense mechanisms, and probably a different topic for a different day, but the thought goes to rationalization. And whether it's the individuals that are on social media criticizing Lizzo, or if it was the husband in the evaluation there, I'm trying to rationalize why this is okay for me but not for you. And that it's defense, it's protection, it allows for that safety and security. And I think that, again, inherently, it's not a bad thing or a good thing, but rather how aware are we of it and how often is it occurring? Because if that's, a one-off conversation where it feels really uncomfortable to kind of be so vulnerable so quickly. It makes sense why we would rationalize. But if we're resistant to change and, we're putting up these barriers and, it's the world that, that's why, then it really keeps us stuck. So, seeing the theme already of, moderation and awareness, but just another way that, biases aren't inherently, positive or negative. They're something that exists.
They exist. Yeah. And we all have them. I think that's the other piece we have to keep saying is that, no one's immune to having them. And, it's how we pay attention to and what we do with them that I think is going to be important.
And well, in terms of paying attention, that blends well to the next bias we're wanting to cover, which is the attentional bias. And so in this bias here, it relates to the practice of paying attention to some things while simultaneously ignoring other things. And then the attentional bias can help us focus on pieces of information that we're viewing as most important, but it also then comes at the cost of disregarding other information based on this bias. And Ray, you gave a really interesting example of this when we were initially talking, coming up with this list. I think it was about a car buying experience, and it lends so well to this. But do you mind sharing that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's that's the first thing came to mind when we were talking about these. Is I have a daughter who's 16, actually 17 now, but when she was getting her car after she got her driver's license, we were car shopping, and which is an interesting experience. And, it was, despite the fact that she's such a level-headed kid in so many ways, it was so easy for us to go to some place and it would be a car that would be this beautiful color, nice and shiny. Dealer or whoever owned the car had it nice and clean. And despite the fact that everything else about the car was completely wrong, 250,000 miles on the car. It was noted that it was wrecked maybe a few times. My daughter thought it was her dream car. Like it was the shininess, the paint color, the fact that it was a car that looked like what most 16-year-olds probably would want. The rest of it didn't matter. And honestly, like if she could have, I think she probably would have been like, let's take the car. And, so yeah, I mean, I think it's easy. And I think we all maybe are a little bit at risk at that when we're buying things. It's to see the external and ignore all the other things that might be at play. So yeah, that was a real life one for me.
And when we were first talking about this one, it reminded me of, and probably more high school and my undergrad, but how I would study. And whether it was reading through my textbooks, reviewing slides, even just kind of going back over my notes, my eyes are always drawn to the bolded terms or, certain words that are going to catch my attention. And, I found myself, especially during those times, really, really skimming materials more than really kind of consuming materials fully. Yeah. And so I had great information, where either the book was directing my attention most of the time, or if it was the slides, kind of what I could pull away from that. But what I would oftentimes miss is the context in which it was being applied in, or some of the background information or the prefacing information that I just wouldn't attend to. And, if I was trying to study for a test, the majority of the information I needed, but it was those smaller context pieces that I think kept me from really being able to do, take it to that next level or take it to that next step. And I think, this was that at play. There's a bold word. Let me read the definition. Let me read the paragraph that it's in. And let me skim through the rest of the text until I get to that next note. This is a key term that I know I'm needing to keep a lookout for, and really not giving that full attention to the entire piece.
Well, you mentioned about the idea of like the bold word. Isn't that maybe some reasons why, in text, we do see things in bold to truly call our attention to the things that we are to attend to and to avoid the other things that maybe are less important. I find myself doing the same thing. I rely on that as a shortcut when we're reading a lot of information sometimes. Yeah, so I mean, I think that I can kind of relate to what you're saying with it.
And it can be really effective. By no means, I don't think I did too badly in high school or in my undergrad program, but it was just something that I really kind of noticed really in hindsight that this is a practice that I had and I was maybe relying a little bit too much on, because there have been some times when, I get a question on an exam, or, probably the worst was like a short answer, an essay question on an exam about something that wasn't bolded or something that I don't remember this because I wasn't attending to it. And so there's so much value, and I think it can be kind of shortcuts or like a highway to getting the condensed information down. But just being mindful and not relying on it too often, because there's been some times I've gotten burned by it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's maybe that's really the key there, right? Is that there are times that we're going to use these things because it's helpful, and this may be an oversimplistic kind of example. I think about it when I'm going to a restaurant. A restaurant gives you this big menu. I attend to certain things. Like there are certain things that I know probably before I walk in the door, roundabout what I want for the day. So if they have a list of all these different things, I'm going to go to probably the areas of the menu that I'm going to attend to because they're where my mindset is for the moment. So ignoring those other things save me time and don't do me harm. I think that's a different thing if I'm critiquing research. Like if I'm reading a journal article where my understanding matters of that information, I think people do it, but we could find ourselves in problems if we just go and read the summary, right? And attend to that without going, wow, was this statistically a sound study? Were there things that we're finding in there? So I think there's attentional bias. I think we all do it every day. Like I think there's that, and sometimes that shortcut's just necessary and doesn't mean anything. I think when we really have to get people and ourselves to pay attention to it is when that is a critical decision that we're making. And those are the times where I think that can kind of get problematic for us. I think it just really depends on the situation.
And I think to go along with that, not only academic wise, or the critique of research, but I'm thinking about how we assign meaning to things and using that as that shortcut. And so if I'm driving up to an intersection and I have a green light, I'm attending to the fact that I have a green light, and I might not be attending to, are the other cars around me also seeing that there's this that I have a green light, which means they should have a red light. And, if we're not attending to the same things, there can be accidents that happen. And, it was a few weeks ago, but the light intersection out here outside of our building, it was just completely off. It wasn't a flashing light. And the number of people that I saw that were just cruising right through there, seemingly not aware that, that there was something amiss there, and others that seemed like there was just almost a sensory overload because they were trying to take in all of the information and creating a decision for themselves. And so I think there can definitely be a balancing act in terms of too much information. We can feel overstimulated, overwhelmed, and that can hamper our ability to make an effective decision. And similarly, if we're too focused or too narrow in our view, then we're maybe not making the most informed decisions. And so it ends up really being about that balancing act.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, and I think maybe the last one that we're looking to cover for today, and it pairs very well with the attentional bias, is inattentional blindness. And for this, we are talking about the tendency to not view things when they are in plain sight, when there is an act of giving our attention to specific features. And, I view this in a lot of ways as just kind of the other side of that attentional bias. It's, the things that don't get seen, or the things that it's the inattentional blindness that has us not looking, maybe under the engine of that shiny, really good looking car.
Yeah, I think probably when we think about this one, the thing popped into my mind was it's all over YouTube. There's a video out there that I think it might even be titled Intentional Blindness, is this idea that these guys are playing basketball and you have to count how many passes they have. And in the meantime, while you're watching it, this gorilla walks through the screen, and most people never see the gorilla. So we're paying attention so much to counting that, and honestly, once they tell you, then you can't stop seeing it. So I always think that's a great, fun example, and really how much our mind can play tricks on us. You started off talking about, the whole idea of illusions. Well, that's pretty much the blindness that they utilize in magic, right? They're trying to get us to pay attention to other things, so we don't pay attention to what they're doing behind the scenes. I think this one's important. The other piece I think that comes to mind with me is we're in a society where this is happening a lot, whether it's our cell phones that we're paying attention to and maybe doing while we're driving or whatever people are involved in. And we're missing other information. Even I think sitting down, talking with people and, you pick up your phone and you get distracted and then you don't hear what someone says. We can miss a lot of information by this blindness in the sense of we fail to pay attention to things because we're distracted so much. So this is happening a lot more, I think, currently.
And, with truly, I think all of these biases, it's not a bad thing, but if we're unaware, it can be dangerous. And I think, that is a theme that is run through all of these. I think, Ray, today we were really thinking that what we could accomplish in 2 episodes, is now looking like we're going to be going into 3, potentially even more. We have quite a lengthy list of biases that we're still wanting to go over just because they have value, but wanting to be able to do that in a way that maybe isn't so overwhelming. So with that, we're hoping to wrap things up here today. Be well, stay psyched.
Paul, we are back again for another duo episode and continuing this discussion on cognitive biases.
Yeah, no, the first few episodes, I think they certainly really made me stop and think about, all of our experiences and all of just the ways that our judgment or decision making is influenced. And I've certainly been finding myself really attending to those biases a bit more so now that we just did the episode on it, trying to increase my awareness. And wow, they're everywhere.
They're everywhere. And I agree. It's like, as we've been talking about them and they're kind of in the front of my awareness, I've checked myself a few times and have actually, found myself even in therapy looking at how others' perceptions are affected by them. So yeah, this has actually been, I think, a great conversation and, nothing new, but something that's nice to have back in awareness again.
Yeah. And I mean, as we've been saying, awareness is key.
That's right.
And to jump back into the rest of the biases here, the next one that we're going to be talking about is the availability heuristic. And for those that you aren't familiar with this, it's our tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events or have a greater trust in ideas that come to mind more easily or more available in our memory. And we can kind of think of this as certain judgments are correct or overstate the probability of an event. And oftentimes this information is easily accessible in our memory. And that's really what makes it seem more reliable.
Yeah. And I think important to kind of recognize we're really not fabricating a memory in this case. We're just really kind of overemphasizing the fact that it's at the forefront of our memory. We kind of started out in saying that, these biases are kind of right now available to us and we are seeing them more or we're paying attention to them more. So really that's kind of with availability heuristic. It's something that's just at the forefront for us. How have you seen it kind of in your practice or life?
Well, and to play off of that, I've since we first started talking about the episode of, biases and, doing some research there, I've been finding myself maybe even over-identifying biases or,
right.
Now that's kind of like, okay, is this bias or is this not? But I think previously when I would have thought of biases, it would have just been that kind of gut reaction or
Sure.
kind of my approximation of what something means, which as I've found, isn't always that accurate. And, as we've been going through and looking at some of these nuanced definitions for some of these, I'm finding myself recognizing like my concept for this is shifting slightly, like this availability heuristic didn't encapsulate all of this. And yet I was talking about it or using it like it did. And so, I feel like I'm kind of going in there feeling like I'm maybe fully dressed, but really realizing I'm missing a few.
Yeah, I think we have to, again, when we're talking about that awareness, it's lack of awareness could be bad. But I think the idea of being overly aware sometimes can take us in the wrong direction too. I think the important part of the availability heuristic, this is really it's a shortcut, right? Like It's our way of kind of being more efficient in how we think. I think sometimes that's good. I think that this idea of making quick decisions isn't always a bad thing. I love to read. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Blink, which is really about these kind of quick decisions. And, there's some things in that book that, really kind of relate to this. what's at the forefront of our memory is what we're kind of paying attention to. It's worth being cautious with. For me, clinically, I look at this probably from a diagnostic standpoint more than anything else, where there are times, for whatever reason, I think in the practice of mental health, things come in waves, right? It's like, it seems like everybody I see comes in with the same type of concerns. And I always have to check myself at those times where I'm kind of like, okay, I've just seen 20 people for ADHD and my mind's really in that realm. I don't want that to influence the next person I see who has attention problems and jump to a quick conclusion. I don't want that shortcut to affect me diagnostically. So with the availability heuristic, I think that's where, as clinicians, I think we have to be aware of that. I've seen clinicians who, they practice a specialty. Maybe they see individuals who have bipolar disorder. And then there's this tendency that everybody they see has bipolar disorder. And I always kind of question, like, is it because that's just the world they live in? Or maybe it's just that that's their specialty and everybody that goes there has that problem. But I just think it's something we have to be aware of. I think it's a good shortcut at times, and one that could cause us problems if we don't pause for a second.
As we're talking, just feel like all of these biases, like while they are their own unique and individual thing, there's just so much crossover. And, we're just looking at this plethora of Venn diagrams, and there's a middle ground. I feel like that's just about all of these. I guess, with the fact we're labeling them as cognitive biases, that's that middle ground. But, to reference something from an earlier episode, how we can fall prey to like targeted ads and things like that. I think it was the confirmation bias.
Yeah.
When we were talking about that. And I'm hearing this as that similar way of, we can be primed to remember things or if with the holidays coming up, and, a Hallmark Channel, I think, is now probably gearing up to be 24/7, like, holiday movies. And there's a perception there that says, family gatherings, get-togethers. And, as I'm kind of thinking like, oh yeah, no, the holidays are this great time, but that availability heuristic might not really be accurate for everyone. And if not letting that influence or making those assumptions that are meant to be a shortcut.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's probably differing views on this. A lot of times when we're reading about things like these shortcuts and biases, as we've said before, it seems like it's always put in this negative light. And I don't know, I think all of these have the potential to be helpful in some ways. And again, it's just, not overusing. I guess the balance of it maybe is important. The availability, I think it happens more than we think. And you mentioned about kind of advertisements. It was funny as we were kind of preparing for this, I was thinking like, I know there's been times like I'm ready to run out of my house and a commercial comes on for whatever restaurant, and I'm leaving, I'm in a hurry, and I'm like, maybe I'm going to stop and grab something to eat. And the place that pops into my mind is the commercial I saw. So, I think marketers use this well. How many times have we, listened to the radio or watch TV, and between, on all breaks, I guess, it's the same commercial repeated. Like we want to be at the forefront of our mind when we're trying to make a decision later. I don't know if we all fall for that, but I think we do sometimes. I know I do sometimes.
And in some ways, I've been going back and just rereading some of Carl Rogers' like earlier works.
Yeah.
I don't know that it necessarily, this is probably an oversimplification, but just one of those themes in terms of person-centered therapy approach. There's finding a balance where like the fully functioning person is able to be aware and cognizant of facts, feelings, and gut reactions. And like those gut reactions, I'm kind of hearing here as that availability heuristic. It's, I'm being pulled into this, I'm compelled to do this. It needs to be balanced. And when you said that, like that really brought that back to mind, my heuristic there.
Yeah. And that's right. And knowing that we have them, listen, I've seen commercials and I've kind of went, oh, I'm hungry, I'm going to stop at the restaurant. And I guess there's a lot of times I go, I'm okay with that. Like it's, it's not a problem. Like I'm kind of like, yeah, maybe I do want to eat there today. I think we got to look at the impact, right? If sometimes I think it's okay doing that. Just it's, I like that word. So
I feel like this, again, the crossover here, but wanting to jump into that next bias.
Yeah.
And, for this one, we're talking about the overconfidence bias here. This one is a tendency to hold false or misleading assessments of our skills, intellects, or talents. And it really ends up being like this egotistical belief that we're better than we actually are. And Ray, like for you, again, personal or professional, what is your experience with the overconfidence bias been?
Again, I think we all have it. I mean, here you and I are sitting on microphones talking to everybody else, telling them about our opinions. We might be a little overconfident at times. It's there's some good things to it. We definitely want confidence in kind of how we make decisions. But again, how do we check ourselves with it? I find it's interesting. I think for me, this has progressed, or my awareness of this has progressed more and more in my career, because I think as you practice longer, you do get confident. And I think there's some of us that do get arrogant. I think that's a possibility. So when I'm working with a team of people, I always have to kind of check myself. And, I kind of in my head go through and kind of go, okay, like, am I really focusing on my hunches too much in this case? Am I looking at my input as being more valuable than other people? Am I listening and really just pausing for a second? And sometimes I'm not. And sometimes I think my opinions probably are going in the right directions. But by asking myself questions, I think it does open me up to really listen a little bit and maybe change my opinion. So yeah, I think that the overconfidence, I've seen it throughout. And like I said, interestingly for me, I have to check myself more and more as I've practiced longer. I mean, I think you do get more confident, and we don't want that to go in the wrong direction for patients.
I can think of it many different times when viewing this with patients as well, and being able to draw awareness to this, or asking them to draw awareness to this. And I think a lot of times it's when we're trying to develop a change in their lives, and there's an expectation, I should just be able to do this. And we're not really going through those full stages there. And I think most recently talking with individuals surrounding, trying to stop their nicotine use, and this idea of like, oh, I'm going to throw my vape away. I'm going to throw my cigarettes away. I'm not going to get any more, and I'm going to stop cold turkey. And that's my plan. Like, okay, like I hear that. I think that can be a valuable start. But if we're not following up with it, or if we're not leaving room for, so what happens when I'm struggling? What happens when I'm going through withdrawal? What happens when, X, Y, Z? And being able to develop those supports measures around that. And there's just this overconfidence that, no, I can do this and I don't need that support. And I think those individuals are oftentimes the ones that I'm talking to who are then really frustrated and upset with themselves that, right. I'm back to vaping, or I'm back to smoking again. And, trying to really use that idea of like, okay, hey, we're relapsing here, but how can we pull something meaningful from this and use that? So I don't think overconfidence can be a bad thing. And I think even when we fall prey to it, it can be valuable in terms of reflection and saying, where have I been arrogant, or where have I been overconfident? And how can I then use those past experiences to be better informed and have a better awareness of it?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's kind of the same way. When I work with people, I love their confidence when they do that. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's a great motivator. I think we want to try to build that confidence. But again, kind of bringing it or dialing it back a little bit therapeutically is important, so it doesn't go in the wrong direction. So I think where this overconfidence bias plays in is we do get confident, and then when it doesn't work out the way we want, it's a big blow to that confidence and self-esteem. And I've seen that happen with patients. Yeah, I always kind of pause for a second with people and just say, this is great. Like, I love your plan. I think that, most of the time they do have a pretty well articulated plan, but pausing and just saying, well, let's talk about the barriers for a second. Mm-hmm. With all problems, there can be barriers. And I often kind of go to the metaphor of, I drive a lot of places, and I know the route that I'm taking. I know where I'm going, but sometimes traffic happens and my hour drive turns to a 2-hour drive. It's a barrier that, despite my good plan and my direction that I had, it gets in the way. So I kind of throw that metaphor out and then say, let's kind of look at our barriers. What's our traffic jams that we're going to run into? And that, I think, helps balance that a little bit, helps draw that back. And then when they happen, it doesn't affect the confidence of it. So it doesn't let them be so overly confident that it creates a problem. So again, being aware of it, kind of looking at those, at how they approach it, we can, I think, use it very powerfully in psychotherapy.
Adapting that, not only their assessment of their ability, but also the expectations, whether that's in results or outcome. Yeah.
There was a great book. I mean, it's written, probably back in like the mid 80s. I know it was before my time in psychology, so it's probably sometime in the 80s. But Donald Meichenbaum wrote this book on treatment adherence. And while they don't necessarily use things like overconfidence bias, when you read that book, one of the things I think is interesting is much of what they talk about treatment adherence, it really are strategies that not only overconfidence bias, but a lot of these biases are some strategies that can be put into place to help people get through them. So if anybody wants to read an old school book, I wish that book was redone again. I thought it was brilliantly done. So just a reference for folks.
Add it to the reading list.
That's right.
Well, and wanting to then jump into maybe this next bias, or in this case, effect. And for this one, we're talking about the misinformation effect. This occurs when we have a memory of an event that is altered or becomes less accurate because of misinformation we receive after the event. And oftentimes we're viewing that as post-event information is interfering with the original memory. And, when we were talking about this, I think there's a variety of ways that this comes to mind. But Ray, for you, what is your experience there?
I think in today's world, I feel like we live this effect all the time. Like on a simple phase, I think or simple basis, looking at just what happens in social media and the information we can get. I just read this morning there was a fake post that CNN ran a story that Donald Trump died. And then they kind of fact checked, and CNN never actually did that story, but I can't remember the exact number, but it was something like 1 million people viewed that information. And I think that misinformation effect can affect a lot of things with that. Clinically, it's interesting. When I was thinking about this specific bias, it drew me back to a situation that happened with me years ago. I used to respond after for like critical incidences. And I was called to go to a situation where someone was shot. And one of the individuals I got a chance to work with, who was probably of all the people that I had worked in, the most traumatized by the experience, and was talking about all the stuff that he saw from this situation, and about the gun and about the shooting, and what the scene looked like afterward. And as we were kind of talking, I said, tell me about where you were at. Give me an idea of your position during this event. And he goes, oh, I was outside. And I went, outside of the building? He's like, oh yeah. He's like, I didn't even get in. He said, it happened and I saw the people running out of the building. And I kind of paused for a second and I said, all the stuff that we were talking about, where did that come from? He's like, oh, that's what I was hearing people talk about. The reality of the situation is it was an awful situation. But what he had described after we kind of got the details wasn't anything that really happened in the situation. He was traumatized by the misinformation. And it was the first time I experienced that. And I mean, this was pretty early in my career. Interestingly for me, it was one of the hardest cases I worked with, because he believed the information he heard so much that he had visions and was having flashbacks, and again, never really saw the situation. I saw another person from that same situation who was within 3 feet of it happening, who didn't have the same reaction. And so I think this could be really powerful, which, again, that was the first time for me. And I don't think I really labeled it that until, as we were kind of preparing for this, I went, wow, yeah, that's really kind of what happened in that situation. So I think it can be a powerful thing that we have to pay attention to.
And I think it's an important reminder to really develop that sense of using the term cognitive flexibility, and allowing for there to be changes and adjustments in how we're perceiving or how we're thinking about various situations. And I can think of, many different client interactions where they're telling me, not only an event that happened, but because someone else told them, and I know that this person did this. We have to go back and question, okay, we're using this idea of we know, with 100% certainty. And you're talking about the person who is really upset with the person we're making an accusation against now. And so if we're looking back at that now, can we reframe this misinformation where, before there was, ready to throw down and, go out and do it and have a brawl. And it's like, well, we don't have all of the information, and, kind of check our sources and really kind of say, if we're not only experiencing it from the first source and we're, getting information from secondary sources or, tertiary sources, like then we need to be able to kind of look at that and scrutinize our own thoughts or our own judgments of that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think it can happen in a lot of ways. And it's the old game, right? As a kid, where you whisper in somebody's ear and you pass it down the chain, and what's the message that comes out at the end? And it's never the same. It just isn't. And they, so, I mean, I think that all of that, kind of, we have to combat it by going to the direct source. And I think that's hard for us to do sometimes. A lot of times I use this with some of the adolescents I see, where they'll be like, oh, well, this happened. And I'm like, okay, hold on a sec. Like, how did you get this piece of information? Well, so-and-so told me. Who's so-and-so, and how did they get that information? And, you kind of backtrack this, and it's like, it's sometimes 10 people removed. And I went, listen, before we have a problem with person X, who's 10 people removed from the person who told you, let's go to person X. Like, let's just pause for a second and really find out what happened. And I just had a case just not that long ago of a teenage girl who was, it was a situation with an ex-boyfriend, and that she was like telling all these bad things about me. And I'm like, let's get to him, like, reach out, let's see what we can do. And it ended up, what he said had nothing to do with it. And I think what was important with that was she could have been angry and started saying things about him. And then it just creates all of this response. And going back, he was like, oh no, like, this is what I said. And it was something pretty benign. And it was just something like, yeah, we just could never really get along kind of deal, which was they couldn't. That's why they broke up. But it got back that, I think at the end, it was like, she was throwing things at his car, and she's like, I never did any of those things. Yeah, I think we have to be aware of it, help people kind of say, let's look at our sources a little bit, because I think it happens often.
Yeah. And I think just that important reminder to like self-reflection and being able to pause and have that moment of, okay, where am I going with this information, or what am I doing with this before making any big decisions there?
Sure.
Well, and to move on maybe then next to our next bias here, we're talking about the optimism bias. This is the tendency to be overly optimistic or overestimate the likelihood of us achieving a favorable outcome or success, and really underestimating the likelihood of experiencing unfavorable outcomes, misfortune, or hardships. And, I've fallen prey to the optimism bias. Certainly, as we've talking about this, I can think of various times in which I'm making a commitment, expecting a certain result. And it's like, no, this is going to happen because, I'm the protagonist of this story, that egocentric kind of view. And so viewing like almost kind of that bias of thinking that, I can't fail. And then going back to when I do fail, that just hurts so much worse. I think overlapping with that overconfidence, but optimism here for me, I think taking maybe bigger risks without really recognizing what the cost of those could be, because I didn't think I'd experience it. But Ray, for you, what are some of your experiences?
I mean, it's interesting. I think right now I am seeing it mostly with some of my patients who are seniors in high schools that are in the college application process.
Yes.
They all think they're going to Ivy League schools, and none of their friends are going to get in. And it's interesting. I mean, I think, again, optimism, it's a great word, right? And I there's this balance of encouraging them, and saying, absolutely, like you want to believe it, but there's a 5% chance you're going to get into this school. And, again, how do we counter that to some extent? So, I mean, I think we all have the potential to do that. I mean, I definitely, I remember I was more like that, I think, as a teenager. You feel kind of invincible sometimes, but it's something I think is present all the time. Got to just be aware of it, but not, I think from a clinical standpoint, we don't want to quash that optimism in people either. Mm-hmm. Like it's again, I think we've said this a bunch of times, and, feels like a little bit of a broken record, but how do we help people balance it? How do we keep the positive pieces, but also have a little check that misfortune can happen to us?
Well, and to move right along here, one of these next ones, and I think this one's a a bit fascinating. Yeah, I think I was familiar with it, but I didn't really have this name for it previously. But it's the halo effect, and this is involves the way that we think or feel about a person or situation being shaped by a singular characteristic. And so, this one positive or negative trait can influence other qualities or characteristics that are related. And a lot of times, I think that this comes out in the idea of like physical attractiveness,
Right.
and how that trait can then be applied to. So they must be a hard worker or a good student, or a variety of positive pieces when they really aren't related whatsoever.
Right.
And so certainly an important one to be aware of. But Ray, what's your experience with the halo effect?
Yeah. Again, I mean, I think we're all prone to that, right? And I agree. I think the physical attractiveness piece is probably I don't know, probably the one that maybe we're most aware of. I'm probably going to mess up this reference, but yeah, I remember at some point being in a history class and them talking about a debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And, probably by most standards, John F. Kennedy was a more attractive person than I think what Richard Nixon would have come across. But what was interesting was people that listened to the debate on the radio believed that Nixon won the debate, that he was the better of the candidates. The people who watched John F. Kennedy or watched it on the TV thought that John F. Kennedy won the debate. And there was this really big difference. And again, I can't remember what the actual reference was to it, but it always kind of stuck to me. And I think that's a great example. I'm always aware of it when I'm doing interviews for people, hiring. It's easy to think the person who presents themselves the best is the best candidate. That may or may not always be true. So yeah, it's something I think we always have to focus on.
And I'm trying to think of examples of this, even outside of physical attractiveness. I'm reminded, and this was probably closer to my own judgment of myself. I was in high school, I would say a pretty good test taker. Like I had some like really good, I guess, skills that are involved in that, which I think helped to shape this perception of, I'm then really engaged as a student. And like it helped to shape this perception based on this characteristic of, I can do well on a test, but maybe I'm not, I think I probably didn't do as much of the reading or maybe as many of the smaller assignments as I should have. And had I not had that one quality, I think that would have changed that perception drastically. And
Sure.
and I think it was more not necessarily the information that I was, pulling in and being examined, but rather being able to look at those patterns that are persistent in test taking, or just being able to use some of those strategies there instead. And so my test taking ability then kind of gave a false consensus of like, I'm a really good biology student, when maybe I was just an okay biology student. And so trying to think of those ways outside of that. And I guess as I'm saying that, like, does that sound like that connects in terms of the halo effect being applied there?
I think there's definitely things other than physical attractiveness. I think the perception of different things. I mean, it's interesting. I see it in people that maybe have wealth, so it's not a physical piece, but they definitely have the finances, that they're somehow perceived that they're good business people or they're good leaders and not necessarily. I mean, it's one of those things where that's an easy way to, we're judging kind of that financial piece as being that they're going to be able to do all these other things. Some people have said that with, kind of the perception of Donald Trump, and not trying to be political, but his perceived success as a businessman and his name on all these buildings. Many people saw that as the best credential for him to be president. Whether he was a good president or not really the debate, but that was definitely an effect in thinking. He had no political background to really judge that on. We judged it on one other factor. So yeah, I think it could be in a whole bunch of different ways. I was trying to think of in therapy how we use this, and I don't know if I came up with a good example. How about for you?
I think I can find myself as a clinician falling into this. If an individual does well with organizing or creating structure for themselves, attributing, maybe more of like a positive outcomes, or
Right.
expecting more positive outcomes in that. And that's not to diminish the value of being organized and having a positive structure, but it almost there being an overvaluing of that and an undervaluing of maybe the other circumstances or situations that they're in. And that might skew my therapeutic approach there. And certainly I've caught myself, I think, more so in the middle of like the therapy engagement there where we're talking about something and they share something and it kind of breaks that disillusion. It's like, okay, no, we don't have as, this plan isn't as solid as I thought just because, you're a good organizer and you're great at developing structure. This doesn't have as much of a sound base of it as it was initially presented. And so finding myself having to be a bit more of an investigator there and not taking things necessarily at their face value. And I think certainly if I'm viewing this with certain clients, when they're coming in and they're talking about just singular characteristics of, relationships that they have. And that shapes my view of this entire person, this one thing that they've done. And now it's like, oh, well, yeah, no, I can empathize that this person really betrayed you and they really let you. And having again to stop and say, okay, I'm only getting one characteristic that I'm basing my entire judgment off of this person. And it can maybe feel very validating for the client, but I don't know that it's all that accurate. And so wanting to encourage that critical thinking and challenging some of those perceptions there, I think can be very helpful.
Yeah, and kind of your two comments, kind of tying them together a little bit, as you're talking, I'm like, wow, like, why didn't I see this? But, I kind of hear this sometimes with individuals who I see for assessments for ADHD. And because they're good test takers, the teachers assume that they are good students. I say assume because, we put so much on grades. And so they're passing, they're getting A's and B's. And people don't realize that, I think, the underlying impact of their attention problems. And I have some of these students who say, listen, I'm working 6 hours a night to study and to organize things. It's really difficult. They do have that one trait of that they test well. And it, for lack of a better word, I think it masks the fact that there's a struggle that happens. And I hear that from people all the time. They're like, and I know we're looking, oftentimes diagnostically for functional impact, but I'm not sure grades by themselves is a way to do that because I do think we miss the hard work that comes in. And so, yeah, I think that test taking piece that makes this assumption and some of the same students I see in college where the test taking strength wasn't able to pull them completely through and they struggle a lot more. And yeah, I think sometimes that, shame on us professionally for not kind of recognizing the bigger picture and not just focusing on, grades are not the only piece to this. There's a lot more that comes in and that I love hard work. I think that's great. They do it, but 3 times the amount of time that it takes a typical student probably is a little bit more. So I think that fits in my head.
Yeah. And I think it's also valuable to then almost be not expectant with it, but it then, we can diversify and explore beyond it, where if someone is presenting with that, how important is it to learn how to study well? And, I'm pulling from my own personal experience here. I was a very poor studier because most of my grades in high school were dependent on testing and I could do well with testing. And then I got to college and I didn't know how to study or I didn't know how to study well. And so I would flounder there quite, especially initially it was, this workload is, I can't just kind of phone it in or I can't just, go through the motions and expect that I'm going to be getting, A's and B's on this. Now I'm actually needing to sit down and I'm finding myself struggling so much more to attend to the studying process where I maybe didn't need to previously. And so, I think being able to explore then what are the assumptions that we're making, even as, the individuals that are impacted by our own halo effect.
Right.
And so being able to then say, learn how to study in high school.
Right.
Even if you feel like you're good,
right.
Learn how to do this skill because it'll pay dividends later on.
Yeah. And I guess kind of ending with this one, I'll say kind of one other thing. I love how conversations kind of where I was a little stuck in thinking kind of opened my thinking. But I think also as clinicians, we have to be aware that, if somebody comes in and they're put together, they dress well, their grooming and hygiene are fantastic. They carry themselves socially well. They can be as depressed and anxious underneath as the person who's disheveled and you feel maybe they functionally are looking more impaired. And I think that's where we, maybe clinically as we're talking, I'm thinking like, Yeah, like we have to be aware of that. It's easy to discount the severity of someone's emotions because on the outside they look like they're put together well. And I know I've seen people who, I think people would be surprised that they were going through the emotional upheavals that they were going through at the time. And maybe we have to be more aware of this halo effect clinically than I was giving it initial power to, because it would be easy to overlook things based on that. And it's a good thing for us to always keep in mind.
Absolutely. Well, and, maybe one of the final cognitive biases that we'll be covering here in this series, but wanting to talk about the false consensus effect. And this is our overestimation of how much other people agree with us or approve of our behaviors. And I think that we can see this in a variety of means. I think social media, someone makes a tweet or makes a post and, they assume that, yes, everyone will relate to this and it will be so well received. And then that's when we see, this negative backlash of almost seemingly catching the person off guard when others can maybe look at that and say, what were you expecting? And, I don't want to pull maybe too much of the current events going on, but I have to think about Kanye West and his anti-Semitic comments. And I think within the first week, he's lost billions, I believe. I'm a bit uninformed of the story, pulling on a probably different bias, in my memory here. But, hearing that false consensus effect there where certainly I think overestimating how positive his perception is going to carry him there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's definitely one we have to kind of keep in mind. And I even think as taking it in more of the therapy room a little bit, listen, I believe I'm an expert. I think a lot of us do. We study hard, we get degrees. And, I think it's easy for us to think that our beliefs or kind of how we're approaching therapy are right. And I had a mentor many years ago said, the only way you know is if you ask. And so at the end of sessions, I find myself helping kind of check this and saying, tell me about how you felt about today's session. Like, were there things that maybe, weren't going the direction you thought? And just kind of checking in with people and, making sure that I'm not over relying on kind of my beliefs of the for lack of a better word, the right approach to therapy for them. And I think that can help us tailor our treatment better and not fall into, we've said this before, kind of that one size fits all type of approach, and being able to really listen and, be aware of that bias from a clinical standpoint.
And I think it can also be great modeling when we check ourselves. And, certain individuals I can think of that I've done that check-in and that, hey, this is where I really found myself wanting to take us. How are you feeling with that though? And does it feel like it fit the need? And, I think that question has so much value when I get not really. And I try to encourage all of my clients. So if there's no hurt feelings, I am here for you. So please be honest with when I'm doing these check-ins. And the times when I get a no, I don't really think that was that important, or no, I don't agree. I think then shows, okay, then we can be adaptive and we can change. And I think, a phenomenal opportunity to say, we don't have to then just run with, this false consensus effect, but rather we can make sure that the therapy is a tailored, unique, adaptive approach to meet the needs of the individual.
Right. Yeah. And I love that idea of modeling. I mean, I've had people when I've said that, they'll go, "Oh, you're the expert." Maybe in the theories, maybe in some techniques, but I think our patients, our clients, they're the experts of themselves, right? And we have to always kind of realize that we're not in their shoes, and that doesn't mean we don't stick with empirically sound, and evidence-based practices, but we can maneuver them in a way that's useful for the patient. And I don't necessarily have research on it, but I will say I think that the clients and the patients I've made the most progress with, they've challenged me a little bit in that way.
And it checks ourselves. It makes sure that we're providing and giving that service ideally as non-biased, or, let me revise that, given all of our conversations, as aware of our biases as possible, because sometimes they end up being that valuable therapeutic resource, but not over-reliant on them or finding a balance with them.
I guess that's kind of the theme that ran through all three of these, the idea of awareness and balance, and all these are great to know. And how do we pay attention to them? That's really the key. So, Paul, I think next episode, we need to take this into the social realm.
I think so.
Talk a little bit about, I think, those biases to continue on this path. But for now, I think it's time for us to wrap.
I think you're right. Be well, stay psyched.